A YouTuber and TikToker called Parkrose Permaculture recently made a couple of TikToks that they turned into a YouTube video on why or how antinatalism is white supremacist and eugenicist. So the video itself on YouTube doesn't have that many views. It's got a bit more views on TikTok, but she has an alright following on YouTube and TikTok. So I thought it was worth responding to. And I kind of knew that at some point someone was going to make this accusation about antinatalism. So I thought it's worth addressing anyway. So let's get into it.
We need to talk real quick about antinatalism. How it's eugenicist and a lot of its thinkings are rooted in the Great Replacement theory and other white supremacy nonsense. Being a child-free individual is not the same thing as being an antinatalist.
So yes, very quickly, being child-free and being antinatalist are different things. They mean different things for your behavior. They mean different things for your ethical outlook. If you want to understand more of the difference, I've already done a video on that. I'll link it in the description.
So here comes the eugenics and the white supremacy. Statistically, the folks who are reproducing the populations that are growing, those are non-white populations. Anytime someone talks about population control, anytime someone advocates for us stopping reproduction as a species, it's a dog whistle to white supremacy because the folks who are having kids are not white.
Okay, so the first thing to say here is that, yes, the majority of population growth that's projected to happen, and I believe is happening at the moment, is on the sub-Saharan African continent. So that is vast majority non-white. But just because most of the population growth that's expected to happen is in non-white areas doesn't mean that the lowest population or the greatest decline in birth rates is in white majority countries. Many of the countries with the lowest birth rates are Asian countries like South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand. These are not white countries. There are white countries with very low birth rates, but just because non-white people are reproducing the most in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't necessarily mean that the opposite is true, that it's just white people who are not reproducing that much. So does that now mean that antinatalism is Asian supremacy as well? And the fact that she calls it a dog whistle just shows that she has no evidence, because if she had anything, she would just present it rather than using this vague notion of a dog whistle. Another thing I want to comment on is that just because a universal message, which antinatalism is, it applies to everyone, just because it may disproportionately impact a certain group, in this case, a group that has high birth rates, and when I say disproportionately impact, I mean it's more of a critique of their behavior than it would be of a group that has very few kids or no kids. Just because that's the case doesn't mean that antinatalism or any universal idea is anti that group of people. Just like if someone is against female genital mutilation, for example, they are against it wherever it happens. Just because it disproportionately happens in certain parts of the world doesn't mean that the people are anti those people in that part of the world. They're just anti the practice, and it happens to occur more in that part of the world.
Now, I'm a leftist. I've seen a number of leftist / progressive / liberal folks who support an antinatalist ideology and turned a blind eye to the fact that what they're supporting is neither liberation nor inclusivity.
She mentions liberation here, and I just thought it was interesting because I thought, liberation from what? Usually when people say liberation, they tend to mean liberation from discrimination, injustice, being downtrodden. Maybe in a more spiritual or Buddhist sense, you mean liberation from suffering or frustration. So let me think. What is the only thing that could achieve this in reality? Not creating someone. The only way you can ensure that an individual is not going to come into contact with any of these things you're fighting against is not creating them in the first place. Of course, in practice, we need to do things that combat these forms of discrimination and injustices because people will continue to exist. But ultimately, if we're talking about white supremacy, the only way to eradicate white supremacy is going to be to not create more people, and then there will be no more white supremacists or no more people to fall victim of white supremacy. As long as you continue to create people, there are always going to be some groups of people who think their race is superior, whatever it is, whether they're white or not. It kind of smacks of hypocrisy to talk about liberation, but then bring people into the very systems that you're trying to fight against.
I have no gripes with people who don't want to be parents. Now, some folks are child-free by choice, even though they'd very much like to be parents in a different set of circumstances. They can't afford to have kids. They feel that it is not ethical to have children in a climate change reality. They feel that America is falling into fascism and it would be irresponsible to bring children into our current socioeconomic and political climate. They buy into the overpopulation myth, another eugenicist belief that I could talk about later. But being child-free is a personal choice. An antinatalist believes that we have a moral obligation as a species to stop having children. So I'm going to disagree and agree at the same time with part of this definition. Antinatalists do believe that it is immoral to have children if you are poor and if the children are brought into a world where there might be things like hunger, climate change, strife, conflict.
Now, she's going to go on to detail more things, so I just want to be quick here. But one thing I wanted to say is the things that she's noted on are not fundamentally the reason that someone would be antinatalist, at least in the philosophical sense. Those are additional compounding reasons, i.e. if your child is going to be born into a particularly bad situation, even many natalists would be against that. The fundamental reason to be antinatalist is that life contains suffering. Even if you're not in these extremely bad situations, the average life contains disease, injury, bereavement, depression, loneliness, hunger, thirst. These are all everyday common things in life. Now, of course, you can include the unusually bad things like famine or war in your arguments for antinatalism. That's completely reasonable, saying even if you think the harms that I was just talking about are not sufficient to not create someone, you don't want to create someone with the risk that they may be exposed to these extremely bad things. But there is a more fundamental reason to be antinatalist.
They believe that kids did not consent to being created, so it's immoral to create children against their will and bring them into a world where there are hardships. It absolutely reinforces the white supremacist belief of the Great Replacement theory, and I'll tell you why real quick. The majority of people on Earth and in America who are procreating are non-white people. The majority of people on Earth who are born into circumstances where they have more poverty, a lower standard of living, and are likely to struggle more are non-white people. It's absolutely a eugenicist belief to see the problem of poverty in this world, and instead of working to dismantle the systems that put people in poverty in the first place, we say, oh yeah, y'all in poverty, especially brown and black people, you can't reproduce.
Now, she seems to be under the misapprehension that antinatalism is anti-poor people. I don't know why she's got this impression, but antinatalism is about all reproduction, not just poor people reproducing. Now, of course, children born into poverty will likely suffer greater harms than children born into affluence. But again, that doesn't mean either are okay. But even then, I think it's fine for antinatalists to be more concerned about reproduction in cases where the harms are particularly egregious, but it should be approached in an ethical and a sensible way without demonizing people. Assist people in poverty in ethical ways that will have the impact of reducing birth rates. Support charities that help these people into affluence, and we've seen that their birth rates will then just naturally decline. Support charities that provide contraception or education around contraception, combating the stigma of using contraception that's peddled by many religious groups. This is a way that antinatalists can disproportionately target, not using that in a negative way, those worse off, but doing so in a way that disproportionately helps them. And I see no issue with disproportionately helping people who are worse off. We disproportionately help people all the time with food aid, economic aid, medical aid, and they are often non-white people. Why is providing contraception and education about how to use contraception suddenly beyond the pale and white supremacy? But again, having said all of that, antinatalism itself is about all reproduction.
It's a very privileged, white, comfortable view.
Okay, so she's saying that antinatalism is a white view. I don't even know what that means. I don't know what a view to have a skin color means. It's like saying algebra is black. Like, what does that mean? Like, if black people happen to be better at algebra for whatever reason, does that mean that algebra becomes black? No, it doesn't. But anyway, antinatalism is not a white view. She's probably overexposed to white antinatalists because she's white. I assume she's in a white majority country. So she's probably overexposed to antinatalism in her specific area and culture. Now, I hate to define people by their race, but she insists on doing this. But just for a minute, throughout history and today, there are many, many non-white antinatalists. And actually, antinatalism seems to be most active in non-white countries like Japan and India. And the largest Facebook groups for antinatalism, last time I checked, were a Middle Eastern one and a South American one. So if antinatalism is a white idea, it's doing pretty shit at being a white idea. And just a note throughout history as well, there is a debate as to whether to call them antinatalist or proto-antinatalist, but the general idea that reproduction is unethical or it would have been better not to come into existence has appeared in many, many cultures around the world. Some of the most famous examples of it are in the ancient Middle East with poets like Al-Mari, Omar Khayyam. So this idea that antinatalism is a white idea, I don't think we should have any time for it.
The This actually reminds me a lot of the video I did a while back on vegan activism and how it is rooted in white supremacy and it supports cultural genocide.
Okay, fuck me. This is not the topic of this video, so I'm not going to get into her critiques of vegan activism. But if anyone's watching this and runs a vegan channel, then if they want to reply to her on the vegan activism front, they can do that.
You may think you're real woke. You may think your stance is like fighting the man, but what it really is punching down on the most vulnerable people around the world. And it is reinforcing a narrative of white supremacy. When you are advocating for a policy that says that nobody should be having babies, in a world where white people are having babies below replacement, you are inherently saying people of color should not be reproducing.
Antinatalists are advocating for people to voluntarily choose not to reproduce. If that means that people who are having more kids have to think harder about this, then sorry. Again, obviously we should not demonize poor people or non-white people and try to single them out some way in our messaging. It should be a universal message, but that doesn't mean we can't engage in activities that disproportionately help those people and have the consequence of reducing their birth rates disproportionately and not out of any sort of hatred of their ethnic group. And for her to try and tie antinatalism to some sort of racist hatred of people is just childish.
You are putting the burden on the folks who are most impacted by poverty, by climate change, by unrest around the world, to take responsibility for the circumstances that predominantly wealthy white people, predominantly men, have created. Instead of focusing your energy on telling people of color not to have children, instead of putting your energy into wanting to convert the whole world into accepting a policy of antinatalism, how about you work to dismantle the power structures that have put those folks in poverty, that have colonized and exploited those folks in the first place? How about you work to dismantle white supremacy instead of touting a eugenicist belief and thinking that it is progressive?
So yes, obviously question and try to dismantle any system that is discriminating against people and causing injustice. Definitely do that because people will continue to reproduce and humanity will go on, so we need to make the world a better place. But it makes no sense to bring someone into the world where we know these things still exist. And even if they didn't exist, obviously there would still be an argument against it. But if you're someone that is fighting against these systems, why would you want to create someone who may become another victim of these systems? You cannot reproduce and fight against these systems at the same time. Anyway, I think that was everything. Let me know what you thought of what Parkrose Permaculture said. Let me know what you thought of my thoughts on what she said, and I'll see you in the next one.